I did not walk into the Bellhaven County Ranchers Heritage Gala for the shrimp cocktail or the string quartet. I walked in wearing my dress blues for the first time in 2 years, carrying a small wooden case with a medal inside that had been waiting 21 years to be pinned on the right chest. My uncle was at the podium when I came through the doors. He was mid-sentence, telling 300 people in tuxedos and church dresses how he had taken in his brother's troubled family out of nothing but Christian charity. He saw me before he saw the 2 Marines in dress blues behind my shoulder. He saw me before he saw Colonel Terrence Mercer walking half a step to my left. He saw me before he saw the woman in the windbreaker with NCIS stenciled across the back, standing near the exit doors like she had nowhere else to be that night. Wallace Calder's mouth kept moving for a second after his voice stopped working. I want to tell you what that felt like. But first, you need to understand how a girl who grew up mucking stalls for a man she called uncle ended up standing in a ballroom with a federal agent, a Marine colonel, and her dead father's silver star. It started 6 weeks earlier, with a wrench, a leaking pipe, and a music box I didn't even know we still owned. My name is Josephine Calder. Everyone who's ever meant anything to me calls me Josie. I spent 10 years in the Marine Corps, most of them as a military police investigator, until an IED outside a checkpoint near Marja took most of the feeling out of my right leg and half the hearing in my left ear. I was medically retired at 28. I came back to Bellhaven County, Texas, because I didn't have anywhere else that felt like it was mine, and because my Uncle Wallace had a big house, an empty guest room, and a story about me that the whole town already believed. The story went like this. Wallace Calder had raised his brother's orphaned girl out of the goodness of his heart after her father disgraced the family and her mother couldn't cope with the shame of it. Wallace never said it in those exact words to my face. He didn't have to. He said it in church. He said it at the co-op. He said it to the loan officer at the bank when he co-signed nothing and asked for everything. What he actually got when I moved home was a ranch hand who didn't get paid. I want to be fair, because fair is something I was trained to be, even when I didn't feel like it. Wallace never hit me. He never raised his voice in front of witnesses. He was a deacon at First Baptist, treasurer of the Heritage Association, the man who'd sit with a widow's paperwork for free because he used to work in veteran services and knew how the forms worked. Every kindness he did in public bought him a little more silence at home. I didn't understand that trade yet. I would. What people didn't see was the way his voice changed once the front door closed. The way family helps family always meant I fixed the tractor, mucked the stalls, ran the books, and slept in the room that used to be a sewing closet, while he took the credit for keeping a broken girl off the street. He called me broken more than once, not cruelly, almost gently, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis. You're not built for much else now, Josie. Be grateful for what you've got. There was one photograph in that house that had survived him. It sat on the mantel in a cheap frame. My father in dress blues at his boot camp graduation, 22 years old and grinning like the world hadn't figured out yet how to disappoint him. Wallace kept it out for the same reason he kept the rest of the performance running. A photograph of a fallen brother made the whole story more convincing. I used to stand in front of it as a kid, trying to feel something other than shame when I looked at his face. Some nights, after Wallace had gone to bed, I'd take it down off the mantel just to hold it, because it was the only piece of my father I had that hadn't been filtered through somebody else's version of him first. I never told Wallace I did that. I don't think I understood until much later that it was the one honest thing in the whole house. I was grateful. That was the worst part. I had spent my whole life believing I owed him, because he'd raised me on a story where my father was the villain and he was the rescue. The story was this. My father, Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Calder, had served with 2nd Force Reconnaissance Company. When I was 9 years old, word came that he'd gone missing during a classified operation in the mountains near the Pakistan border. 2 months later, a different word came. Not missing, not killed, deserted. Unauthorized absence, the paperwork said. Dropped from the rolls. I grew up believing my father had walked out on a mission, and by extension, walked out on us. My mother never talked about it. She got quiet instead, in a way that got quieter every year, until I was 13, and she was gone too. I won't describe how. I'll only say that grief, when it isn't allowed to have a name, doesn't disappear. It just moves house. It moved into her, and then eventually it took her with it. Wallace found her. Wallace handled everything. The funeral, the finances, the whispered explanations to the school counselor about why I might act out. Wallace became, in every way the county could measure, the man who saved me twice. I enlisted at 18 because some part of me wanted to prove I wasn't what my father had been. I wanted to redeem a name I didn't yet understand had never needed redeeming. That's the shape of the lie I was standing inside of the morning I climbed up into Wallace's attic with a pipe wrench, because the guest bathroom below it had been dripping onto the ceiling for 2 weeks, and Wallace didn't believe in paying a plumber when he had a niece with 2 working hands. 1 working leg some mornings, but 2 working hands. The attic over the old wing of the house hadn't been touched in years. Boxes marked in my grandmother's handwriting, a rocking horse with 1 ear chewed off by some dog 3 decades dead, a steamer trunk nobody had opened since before I was born. I found the shutoff valve behind a stack of crates marked Old Ledgers, Do Not Discard, and when I reached past them, my bad leg buckled on a loose floor joist, and I went down hard, catching myself on the shelf. The shelf didn't catch me back. A wooden box the size of a shoebox came down with me, and inside it, wrapped in a moth-eaten dish towel, was my mother's music box. I recognized it the second it hit the floor and split along an old glue seam. I hadn't seen it since I was a kid. She used to wind it before bed. A slow, plain little melody, nothing fancy. I'd forgotten the tune existed until I heard 3 notes of it rattle out as the box cracked open on the attic floor. And then something metal slid out from underneath the broken mechanism. A false bottom, warped with age, had popped loose. I picked it up without thinking, the way you pick up anything that falls near you, and my whole body went still. Dog tags, 2 of them, on a bent chain, dulled but not corroded, like they'd been kept somewhere dry for a long time. I turned them over in the attic light. Calder, Daniel R., USMC, OPOS, no preference. My father's dog tags, sitting in a hidden compartment of my mother's music box in my uncle's attic, 21 years after the Marine Corps told my family he had walked away from his post and his life. I want to explain why that stopped me cold, because if you've never worn a set of tags, it might not land the way it landed on me. When a Marine deserts, when he's dropped from the rolls as unauthorized absence, his gear doesn't quietly come home in a dish towel. It gets logged, inventoried, held as evidence in whatever administrative or criminal action follows. Dog tags don't just wander back into a family's attic on their own, tucked inside a broken music box like a keepsake somebody wanted to protect. Keepsakes are for men who are dead, not men who ran. Underneath the false bottom, there was more. A small leather passbook, cracked at the spine, stamped with a faded eagle, globe, and anchor. And beneath that, a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon that had gone the color of weak tea. I didn't read any of it up there. My hands were shaking too hard to trust myself on a ladder, and some part of me, the part that had spent 10 years processing evidence, knew better than to go digging through 20-year-old documents in bad light with a busted knee. I wrapped everything back in the dish towel, tucked it under my arm like it might catch fire, and climbed down. Wallace was in the kitchen when I came through with the box. He looked at it the way a man looks at a dog that's dug something up he thought was buried for good.
What's that?
It wasn't a question. It came out flat, already halfway to an order. Mama's music box, I said. It was in a crate in the attic. It broke when I fell. Something passed over his face, there and gone so fast I'd have missed it if I hadn't spent a decade learning to read people who didn't want to be read. Throw it out, he said. No sense keeping broken things. I looked at the box in my hands, at the dog tags I'd already slipped into my jacket pocket without deciding to. I think I'll fix it, I said. He held my eyes for a second longer than a man says goodnight over a broken toy. Then he told me not to stay up too late, because the fence on the east pasture needed mending before the Heritage Association board came out for their spring walkthrough, and turned back to his coffee like nothing had happened at all. I sat on the floor of the sewing closet that used to be my room until almost 3 in the morning. The passbook wasn't a passbook, not really. It was a private ledger, handwritten, tracking deposits and transfers over the better part of 2 decades. Some entries were labeled in shorthand I didn't understand yet: DGRAT, SGLI, DIC, County VSO Disc Fund. But 2 entries didn't need decoding. A deposit of just over $100,000, dated while my father's status still read missing, filed under a beneficiary change nobody but Wallace had signed. The reclassification to deserted came 4 months later, after the money had already cleared, right around the time an audit would have started asking who'd signed for it. 6 months after that first deposit, a second one landed, $250,000, routed through an account with initials that weren't my mother's and weren't mine. I didn't know yet what all those initials meant, but I knew Ranch Records. I'd done Wallace's books for 2 years, unpaid, because family helps family. And I knew that Calder Ranch had doubled in acreage the same year those 2 deposits landed, when Wallace bought out the old Hargrove spread next door for cash. Then there were the letters. Some were in my mother's handwriting, never sent, folded into envelopes addressed to a base I didn't recognize. Others were shorter, sadder, written in the last year of her life, addressed to no one at all. I made myself read only 2 of them that first night. I couldn't manage more. She wrote about feeling erased, about believing that nobody was ever going to choose to go looking for the truth, because the lie was so much easier to live inside of than the fight would have been. She wrote that she hoped I would forgive her one day for not being strong enough to wait for something that never seemed to be coming. I sat with those words a long time before I let myself cry, and when I did, it wasn't only for her. It was for the version of myself that had spent 20 years being ashamed of a father I had never once been allowed to actually know. Underneath the letters, at the very bottom of the false compartment, was a single sheet of onion skin paper, the kind used for old carbon copies. Most of it had been struck through with a heavy black marker, government style, the way classified material gets redacted before release. But one line had survived, untouched, in the margin. Remained at the extraction point, under direct fire to cover the withdrawal of the remaining element. Recommend posthumous commendation for conspicuous gallantry. Not deserted, not missing under suspicious circumstances. Covered a withdrawal? Under fire. Recommend posthumous commendation. I read that line so many times, the words stopped looking like words. My father hadn't run from anything. Somebody had taken the last true thing written about him and buried it in a dish towel in an attic, and let a 9-year-old girl grow up believing she came from a family that had shamed itself. I thought about walking straight into Wallace's room that night and putting the passbook on his chest until he woke up. I didn't. Some old, careful part of me, the part that had spent a career learning that the person who confronts too early is the person who loses the case, told me to wait. Told me that a man who could keep a lie alive for 21 years wasn't going to unravel it for me over a kitchen table argument. He was going to lawyer up. Or worse, he was going to make sure whatever else was left to find disappeared before I ever laid eyes on it. So instead, the next morning, I did something quieter. I photographed every page of the ledger and every letter on my phone before the light changed, and I emailed the photos to an account Wallace didn't know existed, one I'd kept for my last unit for exactly this kind of situation. Because 10 years in the Corps teaches you that evidence you don't back up is evidence you don't actually have. Then I put the dish towel and its contents back in the broken music box, wedged it under a loose floorboard in the closet I slept in, and went out to mend the east fence, like nothing in the world had changed. Something Wallace had said to me once, years earlier, came back to me while I was stringing wire in the heat. I'd asked him, not long after I enlisted, whether the Marine Corps had ever reached out about my father's case, whether there was ever anything more to it. He'd looked at me over his coffee and said, "The Marine Corps caused this family enough trouble already, Josie. I settled all that business a long time ago." At the time, I'd taken it for an old man's bitterness. Now the sentence sat differently in my chest, settled, like something that had needed settling, like something somebody had once tried to open back up. I decided I needed to find out who that somebody was. I started with the only lead I had, the initials and the ledger, and my father's old unit. It took 2 days of digging through veteran forums and a Force Reconnaissance alumni newsletter before I found a name attached to 2nd Force Recon from the right years. Colonel Terrence Mercer, retired, listed as a guest speaker at a veterans outreach event in San Antonio the following month. I didn't wait for the event. I found a number for the outreach organization, explained who I was as plainly as I could stand to, and 2 days later, my phone rang with a Virginia area code. "This is Terry Mercer," the voice said. "Careful, like a man walking onto ice he wasn't sure would hold. I understand you're Daniel Calder's daughter."
"Yes, sir."
There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "I have wondered for 21 years," he said finally, "whether anyone in that family ever knew the truth." We met the following week at a diner off Highway 90, halfway between his place outside San Antonio and mine. He came in civilian clothes, but he sat like a man who'd spent 30 years in a uniform, even when he wasn't wearing one. Spine straight, eyes doing a slow sweep of the room before he ever sat down. He was 71, silver-haired, with the kind of stillness in his hands that told me he'd trained himself out of fidgeting a long time ago. "Your father," he said, before I'd even ordered coffee, "was the best non-commissioned officer I ever served with. I want you to hear that from me before anything else gets said today." I asked him why he'd never tried to find us. He looked almost offended by the question. "I did try, Staff Sergeant, for about a year. I called your family's listed contact number 4 times. Each time I was told the family had asked not to be contacted further, that it was too painful, that they needed to be allowed to grieve in peace." He shook his head slowly. "I was a commander with 112 Marines under me, and a war that didn't slow down to let me chase down one family's phone line. I let it go. I have thought about that decision more than any other decision I made in 30 years of service, and I want you to know that before we go any further." It wasn't an apology exactly. It was something more useful than one. A man telling me plainly where he'd failed, without asking me to make it smaller than it was. I put the redacted onion skin page on the table between us. He looked at it for a long moment, then closed his eyes.
"Where did you get this?"
My mother kept it hidden, along with his tags, and a ledger I don't fully understand yet. He told me what the black marker had taken from me. My father's team had been pinned down during an extraction in the mountains, the LZ compromised, half the squad already wounded. My father had stayed at the tail end of the withdrawal, laying down fire alone long enough for the rest of his team to get out, and he never made it to the birds. Mercer had written the after-action report himself. He had personally submitted a recommendation for the Silver Star. "And then," Mercer said, "about 6 weeks later, I got a call from your family's casualty assistance contact telling me the recommendation was being withdrawn because your father's status had been reclassified."
"Reclassified to what?"
"Unauthorized absence." His jaw tightened. "Dropped from rolls. I fought that for months. I wrote letters. I requested a review. And then I got reassigned overseas. And by the time I came back stateside, the file had gone cold, and I was told the family had already been notified and had no further questions."
"Who told you that?"
Mercer looked at me for a long moment before he answered. "The name on the correspondence was your uncle, Wallace Calder, listed as the family's authorized point of contact." I sat with that. My uncle hadn't just accepted a lie about my father. He'd been standing at the door the Marine Corps was knocking on, and he turned them away without ever telling the rest of us they'd come. "There's more," Mercer said, quieter now. 11 years ago, new material came out of a partial declassification review, enough to support a formal correction request. I filed a petition with the Board for Correction of Naval Records myself. I sent formal notice to the family's listed contact, requesting documentation and next of kin input. He rubbed a hand over his jaw. I never heard back. The board closed the file 18 months later for lack of family cooperation. I always wondered whether that letter ever made it to the right person. I thought about the sentence Wallace had said to me over coffee all those years ago. The Marine Corps caused this family enough trouble already. I settled all that business a long time ago. He hadn't been talking about the original casualty report. He'd been talking about Mercer's letter. He had killed my father's correction twice. Once when it happened, and again 11 years later, when somebody had tried to fix it. "I want to reopen it," I told Mercer, "the correction, and I want to understand where that money went." He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his face shifted from grief into something steadier. "Then we do this the right way," he said, slowly, with paper, not anger. "I've watched good cases die because somebody got impatient." I told him I understood. I'd built my career on exactly that lesson. Over the next 2 weeks, I became someone I hadn't been since my last deployment. Quiet, methodical, patient, in a way that costs something every single day you hold it. I kept working the ranch like nothing had changed, because the worst thing I could do was let Wallace see the ground shifting under him before I had somewhere solid to stand. At night, after chores, I sat on the floor of the sewing closet with the ledger and a legal pad, matching dates against everything I could find in the ranch's own filing cabinet. Deeds, loan papers, tax records. Wallace had never bothered to hide from me because he'd never imagined I'd think to look. The $100,000 deposit lined up, almost to the week, with the closing date on the original 110 acres Wallace had bought off a foreclosure auction. The reclassification to deserted had landed only weeks after that closing, timed, I now understood, to bury an audit trail that already led straight to a land purchase. The $250,000 transfer lined up with the Hargrove purchase 18 months later, the acreage that had made Calder Ranch the biggest spread in the county, and made Wallace, for the first time in his life, a man people wanted to shake hands with. The ledger tracked something else too. Smaller entries, recurring every few months for almost 15 years, labeled County VSO Disc Fund. I didn't know what that meant until Mercer explained it to me over the phone one night. Discretionary funds, held by county veteran services offices, meant for emergency assistance to veteran families. Funeral costs, temporary housing, medical gaps the VA hadn't caught up with yet. Wallace had run that office for almost 2 decades before he retired comfortably early. A man in that seat has signature authority over exactly the kind of account nobody double-checks, because nobody wants to be the person auditing help for grieving military families. He hadn't just stolen from us once. He'd been quietly skimming from other families' emergencies for years, using the same seat of trust that let him steal from his own brother in the first place. By the 3rd week, Wallace had noticed something was different, even if he couldn't name it. I was taking Tuesday afternoons for physical therapy that ran longer than physical therapy should. I'd started asking careful, offhand questions about old county records at the courthouse. He didn't confront me. Wallace never confronted anybody directly if he could help it. Instead, the following Sunday, he told me over dinner that he decided it was time I started paying my way a little more seriously, that he was thinking about charging market rent for the room, unless I could show him I was being useful with my time. "You don't have anywhere else, Josie," he said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse. "I'd hate for you to forget that." It was the oldest tool in his box. Remind the wounded animal it has nowhere else to go. I said yes, sir, the way I'd said it my whole life, and went back to counting fence coasts the next morning, and I didn't tell him a single true thing about where my Tuesdays actually went. The break I needed came from a name buried in an old county employee roster Mercer helped me pull. Arlene Whitcomb, listed as a records clerk in the Veteran Services Office for the 11 years Wallace ran it. She was 74 now, living alone in a little house 2 towns over, in a yard so tidy it looked like grief had been mowed into rows. She knew who I was before I finished introducing myself. "You've got his eyes," she said, meaning my father, not my uncle. And something in the way she said it told me she'd been waiting a long time for somebody to come asking. She made coffee she didn't drink and sat across from me at a kitchen table with her hands folded so tight her knuckles had gone pale. "I worked under your uncle for 11 years, she said. "I want you to know that before anything else. I liked him for a long time. Everybody did." "What did you see?" She was quiet for a while. "There was a file," she said finally. "Your father's casualty paperwork. I remember it because it came across my desk twice, once as a standard notification packet, and then again, about 6 weeks later, as an amendment. I'd never seen a status amendment come through that fast, not without a formal review board attached to it." "Did you read it?" I typed the cover memo myself. Her hands tightened further. It cited a witness statement from another Marine, A man who, according to the file, couldn't be reached for follow-up confirmation because he'd been killed in an unrelated incident 3 months earlier. I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. A dead man? Conveniently unable to confirm or deny a story that ruined a living one. "There's something else," Arlene said, and her voice dropped low, like the walls of her own kitchen might still be listening for her employer. "About a year after that, I came into the office early one morning and found your uncle at his desk, practicing something on a legal pad. Signatures, over and over. I didn't think much of it at the time. Men doodle. But years later, when I saw your father's name on a beneficiary form that had come across my desk, with a signature dated for a day I happened to know your father had already been declared missing overseas, I thought about that legal pad every single day for the rest of my career, and I never said a word to anyone."
Why not?
Her eyes filled, and she didn't try to hide it. "Because my husband worked construction for the Calder family for 20 years, and I was afraid of what would happen to his contracts if I opened my mouth. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself that for a long time." She got up, walked to a hall closet, and came back with a manila folder, soft with age at the corners. "I kept a carbon copy," she said, "of the original casualty report, before the amendment. I don't fully know why I took it. I think some part of me knew, even then, that somebody, someday, was going to need to see what it said before it got changed." Inside was a single typed page, unredacted, dated the week my father died. No mention of desertion, no unauthorized absence. Just a straightforward notification of a Marine killed in action, with a note referencing a pending valor recommendation from his commanding officer. Proof in Arlene Whitcomb's kitchen that the story I had grown up inside of had been manufactured from a truth that existed cleanly on paper before somebody decided the truth wasn't useful to them. "I should have said something 20 years ago," Arlene told me, walking me to my truck. "I'm saying it now. I hope that still counts for something."
"It counts," I told her, and I meant it.
She stopped me before I climbed in, one hand light on the door. "I have 2 grown children," she said. "They think their mother spent her whole career filing paperwork for the county, and nothing more interesting than that. I believe I'm going to tell them the truth of it, whatever happens next. I've been quiet in my own house long enough." It wasn't for my case, it was for her, and I understood watching her walk back up her tidy porch steps that some of what I'd started had already reached further than I'd meant it to. With Arlene's carbon copy, Mercer's testimony, and the ledger cross-referenced against county land records, I had enough to stop treating this as a private grief and start treating it like a case. Mercer connected me with a friend of his, a Naval Criminal Investigative Service agent named Priya Anand, who worked benefits fraud out of the regional office. I sat across from her in a windowless conference room and told her everything, start to finish, the way I'd been trained to give a statement. Dates, documents, no editorializing. She listened without interrupting until I was finished, then slid a legal pad toward herself and started writing. "Falsifying a military casualty record is a federal offense," she said. "Fraudulently redirecting a beneficiary designation on a service member's life insurance is another. If the discretionary county funds check out the way you're describing, we're also looking at theft of federal benefit funds and probably wire fraud, given how those transfers moved." She looked up at me. "This isn't going to move fast, Staff Sergeant. I need you to understand that. Cases like this take weeks to build properly, sometimes months." "I understand slow," I told her. "I've been living inside this lie for 21 years. I can survive a few more weeks of doing it right." She brought in an FBI agent named Marcus Coleman 2 days later, once the money trail crossed clearly into federal wire transfers and land purchases that stretched the case beyond a single agency's jurisdiction. Between the 3 of them, Anand, Coleman, and Mercer, working the military side through the Board for Correction of Naval Records, the pieces I'd found in a broken music box became something with weight behind it, something that could actually move. 3 weeks into the investigation, Anand called with something new. The county VSO discretionary fund line wasn't just theory anymore. Her team had pulled the denial records from the years my ledger flagged and matched them against Wallace's approval signature. 3 other veteran families in the county had filed for emergency assistance in those same years. All 3 had been turned down for insufficient documentation. All 3 denials landed within weeks of a deposit in my father's ledger. He wasn't just stealing from you, Staff Sergeant, Anand said. He was stealing from every grieving family that walked through that office and trusted the seat he was sitting in. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. I had started this to get my father's name back. I hadn't expected to find out I was standing in line behind people I'd never met. It did not move quietly enough. 3 weeks into the investigation, a bank officer who'd known Wallace for 20 years mentioned to him, in passing, at the feed store, that some federal folks had been asking about old account histories on the Hargrove purchase. Wallace didn't say a word to me about it that night. He didn't have to. I felt the temperature of the house change, the way you feel a storm front before the sky does anything about it. The first thing he did was start talking about me in town. Nothing loud, nothing you could point to. A comment to the pharmacist about how the leg injury had been hard on my nerves lately. A remark to the pastor's wife about how deployment does things to a person's mind that don't always show on the outside. Small deposits into an account of doubt, the same way he'd once made small deposits into an account that wasn't his to open. Then he told me, over dinner, that he'd made an appointment for me with a psychiatrist in San Antonio he knew personally, a man who understood how to help veterans who were struggling to separate what really happened from what their minds had started telling them. He said it gently. He said everything gently. That was the thing about Wallace. He'd never needed to raise his voice, because he'd built an entire county's trust as a shield, and he was reaching for it now the exact same way he'd reached for it 21 years ago, when a grieving 9-year-old and her mother were too broken to ask hard questions. I told him I'd think about it. I did not think about it. The following week, he announced at dinner, almost cheerfully, that he'd been in talks with a developer about the North Pasture, the acreage that had come from the Hargrove purchase, the same acreage the ledger tied directly to the $250,000 that should have gone to my mother and me. If that land sold and scattered into somebody else's deed, restitution would get complicated in ways I didn't fully understand yet, but that Anand had already warned me about. We need to move, Anand told me on the phone that night. Not recklessly, but we need to move. Mercer, on his end, had good news to weigh against it. The Board for Correction of Naval Records, working off the file he'd never abandoned, and the fresh documentation I'd handed them, had completed an expedited review. My father's status was formally corrected. Killed in action, in the line of duty, covering the extraction of his unit under enemy fire. The Silver Star recommendation Mercer had written 21 years earlier and watched vanish into a drawer was finally approved posthumously in my father's name. The timing lined up almost too cleanly to believe. The correction came through the same week Anand told me the criminal case was ready to support an arrest. And the same week Wallace Calder was scheduled to be honored, publicly, as the Bellhaven County Citizen of Honor at the Ranchers' Heritage Gala he had chaired the planning committee for himself. 3 days before the gala, the Bellhaven Sentinel ran a feature on him. Bellhaven's quiet hero, Wallace Calder, honored for decades of service to veteran families. He read it aloud at the dinner table that night, not to me exactly, more like a man reading scripture to an empty room he wanted to believe was listening. He seemed, for the first time in weeks, entirely at ease. Whatever he'd heard about the bank inquiry, whatever unease had moved through him after the developer talk started, seemed to have settled into a familiar, comfortable certainty that he had already survived worse than this and would survive it again. "You've been quiet lately," he said, folding the paper. "I appreciate that. Sometimes the best thing a person can do is stop stirring up dust that's already settled." I told him I was tired. That much, at least, was true. 2 nights before the gala, he confronted me for the only time in 6 weeks, not about the investigation, not directly, but close enough that I understood he was circling something he couldn't quite name. He'd found me on the porch that evening, sitting with the repaired music box in my lap. I'd spent 3 nights gluing the seam back together, careful, patient work that had nothing to do with the case and everything to do with needing my hands to fix at least one small thing. "I told you to throw that out," he said. "I didn't want to." He looked at the box for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes that I hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly. Fear, wearing anger's clothes. "You've been asking around town. courthouse records. People talk, Josie. I've been trying to understand my own family, I said. Is that a problem for you? It's a problem when it makes people worry about you. His voice had dropped into the register he used to use on my mother, the one I only half remembered until that exact second. Low and reasonable and absolutely immovable. I raised you when nobody else would. I've been more than patient with your difficulties. But if you keep pushing at things that don't concern you, I may need to reconsider whether this house is still a safe place for someone in your condition to be managing on her own. There are options, guardianship arrangements, for your own protection. There it was, the same threat, dressed in the same gentle words, that had once been aimed at a grieving widow 21 years ago, until she stopped fighting entirely. He was reaching for the exact tool that had worked on my mother, and he didn't even seem to notice he was doing it, because it had worked so well the first time, he'd never had to update the method. I looked at him, and for the first time in 6 weeks, I let him see exactly how calm I was. I appreciate the concern, Uncle Wallace, I said. I'll see you at the gala. He went inside. I sat on the porch a long time after that, turning the little brass key on the bottom of the music box, and for the first time since the attic floor gave way beneath me, I let myself feel something other than grief or fear. I felt ready. The Bellhaven County Ranchers Heritage Gala was held in the community hall on the courthouse square, the same room where Wallace had once stood beside my mother at my father's memorial service and told 200 people that the family would carry on with dignity, whatever the circumstances. I remembered that line for 21 years without understanding what it had actually meant. Carry on with dignity. He'd meant his own. Colonel Mercer picked me up himself. He'd flown in the night before, in dress blues he hadn't worn since his retirement ceremony, with 2 younger Marines from the base at Corpus Christi riding with him as an honor detail. Not required, not standard, but Mercer had made a call to a friend who owed him one, because some things deserve to be done right, even when nobody makes you do them. Special Agent Anand met us in the parking lot, in this same windbreaker she'd worn to our first meeting, radio clipped low at her hip. Agent Coleman was already inside, seated at a back table, unremarkable in a way that told me exactly how good he was at his job. You don't have to do this the dramatic way, Anand told me quietly as we stood by the doors. We can execute the warrant outside, quietly, before he ever gets to the podium. I thought about that for a long moment. I thought about my mother, alone in a kitchen for 17 years, believing the worst version of a story that was never true. I thought about a 9-year-old girl who used to apologize to strangers for having a father people whispered about. He gave that story to the whole county in public, over and over, for 21 years. I said, I think the truth is allowed to be public too. She nodded once and didn't argue. We walked in together, Mercer at my shoulder, the 2 young Marines a step behind him, Anand hanging back near the exit where she could watch the whole room. Wallace was at the podium, mid-sentence, a plaque already sitting on the table beside him with his name freshly engraved. And I've always believed, he was saying, warm and easy, the voice he'd used my whole childhood to make cruelty sound like kindness, that taking in my brother's troubled family wasn't a sacrifice. It was simply what a decent man does. I walked down the center aisle in my dress blues, and the room turned to look, the way rooms do when the air changes before anyone understands why. Wallace saw me first. Then he saw the uniforms behind me. Then, last, he saw Anand near the door, and I watched every ounce of ease drain out of his face at once. My father was not a deserter, I said. My voice carried further than I expected it to in that room. And I did not grow up in a troubled family. I grew up in a family that was robbed. Nobody moved, not even the caterers. Mercer stepped forward and opened the small wooden case in his hands. Inside, on dark velvet, sat a silver star. 21 years ago, he said, his voice steady despite everything I knew it was costing him. Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Calder held an extraction point alone under enemy fire, so that every other Marine in his element made it home alive. I recommended him for this medal the week he died. It was buried instead, along with the truth about how he died, by a man in this room who found it more convenient to call a hero a deserter than to let the money meant for his widow and his daughter reach either of them.
A murmur moved through the crowd, uneven, some of it confusion, some of it something closer to recognition. The look of people quietly reassembling 21 years of small, unexplained kindnesses from Wallace Calder into a very different shape. A woman near the front, the pastor's wife who had once told me deployment does things to a mind, put her hand over her mouth and did not take it away again. An older rancher who'd known my father as a boy stood up slowly from his table, said nothing, and simply stared at Wallace the way you stare at a fence line you've walked past every day of your life and only just now noticed was crooked.
Wallace found his voice, thin and too fast. "This is... Josie, whatever you think you found, this is not the place."
"It's exactly the place," I said. "You picked it."
I handed him the small case containing my father's corrected service record and the board's formal notice of the posthumous award, because some part of me needed him, specifically to be the one holding proof of the thing he'd spent 2 decades burying. He took it because his hands moved before his mind caught up to what was happening, and for 1 second, under the Gala lights, in front of every person in Bellhaven County who had ever called him a good man, Wallace Calder held his brother's silver star and had absolutely nothing left to say.
Agent Anand came down the aisle then, unhurried, badge already out.
"Wallace Calder," she said, "you're under arrest for falsification of federal military records, fraudulent conversion of service member benefits, and theft of federal funds. You have the right to remain silent." He looked at me while Coleman came around from the back table to assist. Not angry, not yet. Something smaller than that. The look of a man watching a story he'd told so many times he'd nearly started believing it himself, finally run out of road. "I raised you," he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear it over the sound of chairs scraping back across the room. "You raised me on a lie," I said. "I'm not angry that you're finally paying for it. I'm just done letting it cost anyone else." They walked him out through a side door, past the plaque with his name still sitting on the table, engraved and useless now. Nobody clapped when he left. Nobody clapped when I turned to face the room either. Some things aren't meant to end in applause. They're just meant to end. The weeks that followed moved slower than the Gala had, the way real consequences almost always do once the drama's over and the paperwork begins. The Board for Correction of Naval Records finalized my father's record. Killed in action, Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry. His name added to a memorial wall at the Reserve Center 2 counties over, that I visit now more often than I ever expected to. Wallace was indicted on 11 federal counts. The Land Records Office, working with the U.S. Attorney's Office, began the slow process of unwinding 2 decades of fraudulent purchases. The North Pasture, the original 110 acres, the ranch house itself, all of it traced back to money that had never been his to spend. Restitution doesn't move as fast as television makes it look. It took the better part of a year, but it moved, steadily, in the right direction, the way things do when the truth finally has paperwork behind it, instead of just a broken music box in an attic. I drove out to the Reserve Center the week they added his name to the memorial wall. I went alone, on a Tuesday, when I knew the parking lot would be empty. I found GYSGT Daniel R. Calder, etched into granite between 2 names I didn't recognize, and I stood there long enough that a groundskeeper eventually came over to ask if I was all right. I told him I was the daughter, and he took his cap off without my asking him to, which is a small thing, but it undid me more than the Gala ever had. I left my father's photograph from the mantel propped against the base of the wall for an afternoon, just so some part of him could see it, before I took it back home to the shelf where it belongs now. Calder Ranch came back to me, not as a gift, not as an inheritance, but as a correction. It had always been the name on the deed my father should have had the chance to leave me himself. Not everyone in the county took it well. A cousin on Wallace's side stopped speaking to me entirely, convinced I'd invented most of it out of spite, unable to reconcile the man who'd loaned him truck money with the man federal prosecutors described in a 60-page indictment. I understood that better than I expected to. It's hard to let go of a story you've built a life around, even when the truth walks in wearing a uniform and holding a medal. I let him keep his version.
I stopped needing everyone to believe mine. Some things don't come back at all, and I've stopped expecting them to. My mother is still gone. For 17 years since I lost her, I let myself believe she'd been the one who couldn't hold on, a woman abandoned by a man who ran. She wasn't abandoned. She was betrayed by someone standing close enough to catch her who let her fall anyway. That didn't undo itself the day a jury heard the word guilty. There is no verdict on earth that gives a 13-year-old girl her mother back, or gives that mother even one more year to learn the truth before it was too late for her to feel it land. I carry that. I expect I'll carry it the rest of my life, the way you carry any wound that healed wrong the first time and had to be broken again just to be set right.
But I put her music box on the shelf in my own living room now, in the house that used to be my uncle's and is finally, legally, mine. I fixed the seam myself. Slow, careful work, the kind you can't rush without ruining. It plays again. Not perfectly. There's a small hitch on the fourth note, where the mechanism never quite recovered. I've decided I like it that way. Nothing that's been broken and mended sounds exactly the way it did before, and I don't think it's supposed to. I keep my father's dog tags on a chain around my neck now, next to my own. 2 Marines, 1 family. 1 true story instead of 2 lies that almost erased both of them.
I used to think justice would feel like winning. I stood in that ballroom and watched a man who had stolen 21 years from my family get walked out in handcuffs in front of every person who had ever admired him. And I want to tell you, it felt like triumph. It didn't. It felt like setting something down I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it had a weight of its own. Relief, not victory. There's a difference, and nobody tells you that until you're standing in the middle of it.
Revenge asks what will make him suffer the way I suffered. Justice only asks one thing. Will the truth, once it's out, be strong enough to stand on its own? Mine was. It took 21 years, a broken music box, a retired colonel who never stopped believing my father, an old woman brave enough to finally open a closet, and 2 federal agents willing to be patient with a case that started as nothing more than a photograph of a handwritten ledger. But it stood. If there's a silence in your own family that never quite added up, a version of events that always seemed to protect the person telling it more than the person it was supposedly about, I hope this is the reminder you needed. It's not too late to ask the harder question. If this story found you, pass it on to somebody who needs to hear that the truth is still worth digging for, no matter how many years it's been buried.